The scorching sun beat down mercilessly on Nora McAllister as she squinted at the horizon, her cracked lips parting in a silent prayer for salvation. It was the summer of 1876, and the unforgiving Idaho Territory seemed determined to claim her and her two young children as its next victims. 3 days stranded in this wasteland after her husband abandoned them, taking their wagon, supplies, and any hope of survival. Nora clutched her 5-year-old daughter Emma's hand while baby Thomas whimpered against her chest, his tiny face red from the relentless heat. "Mama, I'm thirsty," Emma whispered, her once bright eyes now dull with exhaustion. "I know, sweetheart," Nora replied, feeling the familiar stab of helplessness. The small canteen she'd managed to grab before Gerald left contained only a few precious drops. She had been rationing it, giving most to the children, but now they were down to nothing. She adjusted Thomas in her arms, wincing as her sunburned skin protested the movement. The baby had stopped crying as vigorously as before, which frightened Nora more than his wailing had. Her own strength was failing, each step through the ankle-deep dust requiring more effort than the last. The small outcropping of rocks ahead offered their only hope for shade, and she stumbled toward it with grim determination. "Just a little farther, Emma," she encouraged, though her own voice sounded strange in her parched throat. They hadn't seen another soul in days. Gerald had deliberately taken them off the main trail before abandoning them, his final act of cruelty in a marriage that had become nothing but a prison of fear and pain. Nora had endured his brutality for years, staying for the children, but when he started raising his hand to Emma, something inside her finally broke. She had confronted him, told him she wanted to leave, return east to her family. His response was to drive them to this desolate stretch of nowhere and leave them to die. As they reached the rocks, Nora helped Emma sit down before collapsing beside her. Thomas had fallen into a fitful sleep, his breathing shallow. She knew with terrible certainty that without water soon, they would not survive another day. The sound came so faintly at first that Nora thought she was imagining it the rhythmic thud of hoofbeats. She raised her head, squinting against the glare. A silhouette appeared on the horizon, a lone rider approaching slowly through the heat haze, fear and hope warred within her. In these territories, not all strangers were saviors. Some were more dangerous than the elements themselves, but what choice did she have? Summoning her last reserves of strength, Nora stood on trembling legs and waved her free arm desperately. The rider changed course, heading directly toward them. As he drew closer, she could make out a tall figure on a chestnut horse, the broad brim of his hat casting his face in shadow. His clothing was dusty from the trail, a rifle strapped to his saddle, and a bandana pulled up to protect his face from the dust. He reined in his horse a few paces away, those keen eyes taking in the scene before him, a woman clutching an infant, a small girl huddled in the meager shade, all of them clearly at the end of their endurance. Slowly, he pulled down his bandana, revealing a face weathered by sun and wind, with a strong jaw darkened by several days' growth of beard. But it was his eyes that caught Nora's attention, a startling blue against his tanned skin, and filled with something that looked remarkably like compassion. "Madam," he said, his voice low and gravelly from dust, "looks like you folks are in a bad way. Please," Nora croaked, her pride long since abandoned. "My children." He swung down from his horse in one fluid motion, the movement of a man who'd spent his life in the saddle. Up close, she could see he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30 or so, with streaks of premature silver at his temples. "Name's Vaughn Lassiter," he said, pulling a canteen from his saddle. "Drink slow now." Nora's hands shook so badly he had to help her, holding the canteen to her lips. The water was warm but tasted like life itself. She pulled away after just a few sips. "The children first," she insisted. His expression softened further as he nodded, kneeling beside Emma to help her drink. The little girl regarded him warily at first, but thirst overcame caution. For the baby, he poured a small amount into his bandana and gently moistened Thomas's parched lips. "How long you been out here?" he asked, his eyes scanning the barren landscape. 3 days, Nora replied. My husband. He left us? Something dangerous flashed in Vaughn's eyes, but his voice remained steady. Left you out here, with young uns? Nora merely nodded, too exhausted for explanations. He was silent for a moment, then seemed to come to a decision. My ranch is about 4 hours' ride from here. Not much, but there's clean water, food, and shelter. He looked directly at her, his expression serious. Come with me. Those 3 simple words held more kindness than Nora had experienced in years. Still, caution made her hesitate. I don't know you, Mr. Lassiter. No, madam, you don't, he agreed. But these little ones won't last another day out here, and neither will you. His voice softened. I've got a sister at the ranch. You'll be proper safe, I give you my word. Nora looked down at Emma's hopeful face, then at Thomas's too still form. What choice did she have? Death awaited them here with certainty. Thank you, she whispered. Vaughn nodded once, then set about preparing for their journey. He lifted Emma onto his horse first, then helped Nora up behind the saddle, making sure she had a secure grip on both the baby and the pommel. With a gentle click of his tongue, the horse began moving, Vaughn walking alongside, leading them away from what would have been their grave. As they traveled, Nora felt something unfamiliar rising in her chest. It took her a moment to recognize it as hope, a feeling she'd almost forgotten existed. The journey to Vaughn's ranch was arduous, despite his horse bearing their weight. He walked alongside with a steady, ground-eating stride that never faltered, occasionally offering the canteen or checking on the children. Emma had fallen into an exhausted sleep, leaning back against Nora, while Thomas had begun to show signs of improvement, his whimpering more vigorous now that he had some moisture in his tiny body. How much farther? Nora asked as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the heat only slightly less oppressive than at midday. About an hour, Vaughn replied, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. Snake River Valley's just beyond that ridge. My place sits at the edge of it. Snake River, she repeated. I've never heard of it. A small smile touched his lips. Not many have. It's a small settlement, handful of ranches, a general store, smithy, and a saloon that doubles as a hotel when necessary. Not much, but it's home. Nora studied his profile as he walked. There was something compelling about Vaughn Lassiter, a quiet strength that radiated from him. Not the false bravado of men like Gerald, who used their strength to dominate and harm, but something deeper, more genuine. Why are you helping us? She found herself asking. He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer, but finally he said, My ma and little brother died of thirst and exposure when I was 10. Pa had gone for supplies, got caught in a flash flood. By the time I found help, it was too late. His voice was matter of fact, but Nora could hear the old pain beneath it. No one should die that way, especially not children. The simple honesty in his words touched something in Nora. She'd grown so accustomed to Gerald's lies and manipulations that Vaughn's straightforwardness felt almost foreign. I'm sorry about your family, she said softly. He nodded once in acknowledgement, but didn't speak further on the subject. As they crested the ridge an hour later, Snake River Valley spread out before them, a ribbon of green following the winding path of the river through the otherwise arid landscape. Scattered buildings made up the tiny settlement, with homesteads and ranches dotting the surrounding area. There, Vaughn pointed to a modest spread about a mile from town. Rocking L Ranch, not much to look at, but the wells never run dry. It wasn't much to look at, a small main house built of rough-hewn logs with a covered porch, a barn, corral, and a couple of outbuildings, but to Nora's eyes, it was the most beautiful sight imaginable. Thin wisps of smoke rose from the chimney, and as they drew closer, she could see a figure step out onto the porch, shading her eyes against the setting sun. That'll be my sister, Vivian, Vaughn explained. Been keeping the place running while I was out checking the north pasture. By the time they reached the yard, Vivian was hurrying toward them, her expression shifting from welcome to concern as she took in the scene. Vaughn, what's happened? Found them abandoned out past Coyote Flats, he explained briefly. Madam needs water, food, and rest, the little ones too. Vivian, a practical-looking woman in her mid-20s with the same striking blue eyes as her brother, immediately took charge. Bring them in. I'll heat water for baths and put on a stew." With gentle efficiency, they were ushered into the house. Nora, still clutching Thomas, found herself guided to a rocking chair while Vaughn carried a half-awake Emma. The interior was simple but clean, with handmade furniture and colorful quilts providing touches of warmth. "I'm Vaughn Lassiter," Vaughn's sister introduced herself, already pouring cool water from a pitcher. "And you are Nora McAllister. These are my children, Emma and Thomas." She accepted the water gratefully. "I don't know how to thank you both." "No thanks needed," Vivian assured her, her kind eyes assessing Nora's condition. "You're safe now, that's what matters." Over the next few hours, Nora experienced more kindness than she had in years. Vivian helped her bathe the children and then herself, provided clean clothing that was too large but blessedly fresh, and served a simple but nourishing stew with fresh bread that seemed like a feast after days of starvation. Through it all, Vaughn kept a respectful distance, tending to his horse and chores, appearing only at supper time to eat quickly before excusing himself to check on the livestock. But Nora caught him watching her and the children with thoughtful eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. That night, sleeping in a real bed in a small spare room with her children beside her, Nora allowed herself to cry for the first time quiet tears of relief, gratitude, and lingering fear. What would become of them now? She had no money, no possessions beyond the clothes on their backs, and nowhere to go. Gerald had effectively cut her off from her family back east, and she had no idea if they would even welcome her back after all this time. But for tonight, at least, her children were safe, fed, and sleeping peacefully. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. For now, that was enough. The soft light of dawn was filtering through the simple muslin curtains when Nora awoke, momentarily disoriented by unfamiliar surroundings. Thomas stirred beside her, his small face peaceful in sleep, while Emma had thrown an arm across her brother in protective slumber. The events of the previous day came rushing back, and with them a wave of gratitude so profound it brought tears to her eyes. The smell of coffee and bacon drew her from the bed. She smoothed her borrowed dress, one of Vivian's that hung loosely on her thinner frame, and quietly left the children sleeping. In the main room, she found Vaughn seated at the table, a cup of coffee in his work-roughened hands. He stood immediately when he saw her. "Morning, Mrs. McAllister. Hope you slept well." "Please call me Nora," she said, suddenly shy in the light of a new day. "And yes, thank you, better than I have in a very long time." He nodded toward a pot on the stove. "Coffee's hot if you're wanting some." "Vivian's gone to collect eggs." Nora poured herself a cup, noting how the simple domestic task seemed strange after days of desperate survival. "Mr. Lassiter, Vaughn," he corrected gently. "Vaughn," she amended with a small smile. "I need to be honest with you. I have no money to repay your kindness and no place to go from here." He regarded her steadily. "No family back east. My parents are in Boston, but..." She hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "My husband made sure I lost contact with them years ago. I don't even know if they're still alive." Something in Vaughn's expression hardened. "Your husband, the one who left you and those babies to die?" It wasn't a question, but Nora nodded anyway. "Gerald McAllister. We've been married 6 years. It wasn't a good marriage." The admission felt both terrifying and liberating. Vaughn was quiet for a moment, sipping his coffee. "Well, you're welcome to stay here until you figure things out. We've got the room, and Vivian would appreciate the company." "I couldn't impose. It's not an imposition," he interrupted firmly. "Besides, those little ones need time to recover." The door opened as Vivian returned, basket of eggs in hand, saving Nora from having to respond. The morning proceeded with a simple breakfast, the children waking hungry and looking better after a night of proper rest. Emma, initially shy with the strangers, was quickly won over by Vivian's gentle manner and the promise of helping to feed the chickens. After breakfast, Vaughn excused himself to tend to ranch duties, leaving Nora with Vivian. As they washed the dishes together, Vivian glanced at her curiously. "Vaughn says you were abandoned," she said, her tone gentle but direct. "Was it Indians, bandits?" Nora's hands stilled in the wash basin. "No, it was my husband." Vivian's sharp intake of breath was followed by a muttered curse that would have scandalized Nora's Boston upbringing in another lifetime. Your own husband left you out there to die. Nora nodded, keeping her voice low so the children, playing with a wooden horse Vaughn had given Emma, wouldn't hear. Gerald, changed after we married, or perhaps I just didn't see him clearly before. When I finally stood up to him, threatened to take the children and leave, he drove us out into the wilderness, took everything, and left us. The miserable coward, Vivian said fiercely. Forgive my language, but men who hurt women and children are the lowest form of vermin. You don't seem shocked, Nora observed. Vivian's expression grew somber. My father was a similar sort of man. Not to me, Vaughn made sure of that, but to our mother. She died when I was 16, as much from a broken spirit as anything else. She dried her hands on her apron. Is that why you have no place to go? Did he cut you off from your people? Yes, Nora admitted. My family didn't approve of the marriage. Gerald was charming when he wanted to be, but my father sensed something wasn't right. After the wedding, we moved west, and Gerald made sure I couldn't maintain contact. Vivian placed a hand on Nora's arm. You're safe here. Vaughn's nothing like that. He's the best man I know, raised me after our parents died, built this place from nothing. Something in her tone made Nora look more closely at the other woman. You sound as though you're trying to reassure me. A small smile touched Vivian's lips. Maybe I am. I saw how he looked at you and those children last night. My brother spent his whole life taking care of others, never thinking of himself. It would do my heart good to see him find some happiness. Heat rushed to Nora's face. Vivian, I'm still married. And even if I weren't, I'm not matchmaking, Vivian interrupted, though her eyes suggested otherwise. Just saying you're both good people who have had hard roads. Now let's see about finding some clothes that fit you and the little ones better. The days fell into a surprisingly comfortable rhythm. Nora insisted on earning her keep, helping Vivian with household tasks and gradually taking over the cooking as her strength returned. Emma bloomed under the freedom of ranch life, following Vivian around like a shadow and developing a fascination with the horses. Even baby Thomas grew stronger, his cheeks filling out and his crying lessening as he settled into regular feeding and sleeping patterns. Vaughn remained a somewhat elusive figure, leaving early for ranch work and often returning late, though he never failed to spend time with Emma each evening, patiently answering her endless questions and whittling small wooden animals for her growing collection. With Nora, he was unfailingly polite but maintained a careful distance that she both appreciated and increasingly found herself wishing he wouldn't. A week passed, then two. Nora knew they couldn't stay indefinitely, living on the Lassiter's charity, but whenever she broached the subject of leaving, both siblings found reasons to postpone any decision. At least until the next supply wagon comes through, or after the roundup when there's more cash to spare. It was during the third week that everything changed. Nora was hanging laundry in the yard when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Shading her eyes against the sun, she saw a rider coming fast down the road toward the ranch. Something about the urgency in his pace sent a shiver of apprehension down her spine. Vaughn emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag as the rider pulled up in a cloud of dust. Lassiter, the man called, breathing hard. You'd best come into town. There's a feller at the saloon asking questions about a woman and two young'uns. Says his wife ran off with his children. Nora's blood turned to ice. Gerald, it had to be. Vaughn's expression hardened as his eyes flicked to her. What's he look like, Jim? Tall, well-dressed, Eastern accent. Carries himself like he's somebody important. Name of McAllister. The rag in Vaughn's hand twisted as his fingers clenched. Tell Hank at the saloon to keep him there if possible. I'll be along shortly. As the rider departed, Vaughn turned to Nora, who stood frozen by the laundry basket, her face drained of color. He's found us, she whispered, panic rising in her throat. Vaughn, he'll kill me. And the children? No, Vaughn said with such quiet certainty that some of her terror receded. He won't harm any of you, I'll make sure of that. He crossed to her, gently taking her trembling hands in his. Nora, I need to know the truth of what happened, all of it. The story poured out of her, then the gradual isolation from her family, the verbal abuse that evolved into physical violence, how she'd endured it all until he started turning his rage on Emma. I told him I was leaving, going back to my parents. He seemed to agree, said he'd take us to the nearest stage stop. Instead, he drove us out into the wilderness, took everything but the clothes on our backs, and left us to die. Vaughn's face was like stone by the time she finished, but his voice remained gentle. You and the young'uns stay here with Vivian. Lock the doors, I'll handle this. What are you going to do? Fear made her voice sharp, his blue eyes held hers. I'm going to make sure he never threatens you again. Trust me, Nora, something in his steady gaze calmed her racing heart. This was not Gerald's impulsive rage or calculated cruelty. This was something else entirely, a resolute strength that sought to protect, not control. I do trust you, she realized aloud. Just be careful, Gerald is dangerous when crossed. The faintest smile touched Vaughn's lips. So am I when those I care about are threatened. He strode to the barn to saddle his horse, and minutes later was riding toward town, his straight-backed figure growing smaller in the distance. Nora watched until he disappeared, then hurried inside to find Vivian already gathering the children, her normally cheerful face set in grim lines. I heard, she said simply. We'll go to the root cellar if necessary. Vaughn will handle it. You don't know Gerald, Nora said, clutching Thomas to her chest. I know my brother, Vivian interrupted firmly. And no Eastern dandy who abandons his family is going to stand against him. The hours that followed were the longest of Nora's life. She tried to keep Emma distracted with stories and small tasks, but her own mind was consumed with terrifying possibilities. Gerald was charming and persuasive. What if the townspeople believed his lies? What if there was violence? What if Vaughn was hurt or worse? That last thought brought with it a rush of emotion so strong it startled her. In just 3 weeks, Vaughn Lassiter had become important to her in ways she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge. It was nearly sunset when they heard the approaching riders. Vivian, who had been watching at the window, suddenly relaxed. It's Vaughn and Sheriff Miller. Nora hurried to the door, Emma clinging to her skirts as the two men dismounted. Vaughn's expression was unreadable, but there was no sign of injury or distress. The sheriff, a weather-beaten man in his 50s with a gray streaked mustache, removed his hat as he approached. Mrs. McAllister, he greeted her. I'm Sheriff Isaac Miller. Wonder if I might have a word. Inside, with the children settled in the bedroom under Vivian's watchful eye, Sheriff Miller got straight to the point. Your husband made quite a scene in town, madam, claiming you'd stolen his children and run off. Painted a pretty picture of a devoted father desperately searching for his family. Nora's hands twisted in her lap. It's not true. I know that, madam, Miller interrupted gently. Mr. Lassiter here told me what really happened. Left you and those little ones to die in the Badlands, did he? She nodded, struggling to keep her composure. Well, abandonment's a serious crime in these parts, so's attempted murder, which is what leaving folks without water amounts to. The sheriff's eyes were kind but determined. I'd like to arrest him, madam, but there's complications. What complications? Nora asked, dread coiling in her stomach. Vaughn, who had been standing silently by the fireplace, spoke up. McAllister's got friends in high places, claims he's connected to a territorial judge and some railroad investors. Sheriff Miller nodded. Man like that can make trouble even if he's in the wrong, but there's another way. He looked at Nora steadily. Divorce. The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. Divorce was scandalous, almost unheard of in polite society. But then, so was a husband abandoning his family to die of thirst. Idaho territory has liberal divorce laws, madam, the sheriff continued. Cruelty and abandonment are both grounds. Judge Warren comes through here every 6 weeks on circuit. He'd hear your case. And Gerald would just accept that, Nora asked skeptically. He would if the alternative was prison, Vaughn said, speaking for the first time since they'd entered the house. I made that clear to him. There was something in his tone that made Nora look at him sharply. What did you do? Nothing that needs discussing in front of the sheriff, Vaughn replied with the ghost of a smile. Let's just say Mr. McAllister understands his options now. Sheriff Miller cleared his throat. "Your husband's at the hotel in town, madam. He's agreed to stay there until the judge arrives next week. I've got deputies keeping an eye on him." He rose to his feet. "Think about what I said. Divorce would give you a fresh start, legal custody of your children." After the sheriff departed, Nora sat in stunned silence, trying to process everything. Divorce, freedom. A concept so foreign she could hardly grasp it. "You don't have to decide tonight," Vaughn said quietly, taking the chair the sheriff had vacated. "But for what it's worth, I think Miller's right. It's the cleanest way to be shut of him for good." "Did you hurt him?" Nora asked suddenly. "Gerald," Vaughn's expression was unreadable. "No, though I wanted to." His jaw tightened. "Man like that doesn't deserve the consideration, but I figured you and the young'uns have seen enough violence." Relief flooded through her, followed by a wave of emotion so strong it brought tears to her eyes. "Thank you, not just for today, but for everything. You saved us, gave us shelter, and now—" She trailed off, unable to express the depth of her gratitude. "You don't need to thank me for being decent, Nora," he said simply. "Any man worth the name would have done the same." "No," she contradicted softly. "They wouldn't. Most would have ridden past or demanded compensation." She couldn't quite meet his eyes on the last word, but her meaning was clear. Vaughn's expression darkened momentarily. "I'm not most men." "No," she agreed, finally looking directly at him. "You're not." Something passed between them in that moment, an acknowledgement, perhaps, of feelings neither was ready to name. Then Vivian called from the bedroom that Thomas was hungry, breaking the spell. As Nora rose to attend her son, Vaughn said, "Whatever you decide about the divorce, you and the young'uns have a place here for as long as you want it. I need you to know that." The simple statement, delivered without expectation or demand, meant more to Nora than all Gerald's extravagant promises ever had. For the first time in years, she felt the stirrings of hope for a future that might hold more than mere survival. The week leading up to the judge's arrival passed in a strange limbo. Gerald remained in town as agreed, but his presence cast a shadow over Nora's newfound peace. Sheriff Miller rode out twice to check on them and report that McAllister was behaving himself, though the saloon owner complained he was drinking too much and talking too loud. Vaughn increased his vigilance, always carrying his rifle when working the far pastures and making sure the house was secure at night. If he rode into town for supplies, Vivian's friend Eliza Thornton came to stay at the ranch, her husband's shotgun prominently displayed on the kitchen table. Despite these precautions, Nora found her resolve strengthening rather than weakening. The possibility of freedom, real freedom, was too precious to relinquish out of fear. She began to imagine a life where she didn't flinch at loud noises, where Emma could laugh without being scolded for childish exuberance, where Thomas would grow up knowing only kindness from the men in his life. Increasingly, those imaginings included Vaughn. She caught herself watching him as he worked around the ranch, admiring the quiet competence in his movements, the gentleness with which he handled both animals and Emma's constant questions. He never raised his voice, never showed impatience, yet there was nothing weak in his demeanor. His was a strength born of character rather than dominance. The evening before Judge Warren was due to arrive, Nora sat on the porch after the children were asleep, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Vaughn joined her, offering a cup of coffee which she accepted with a small smile. "Beautiful evening," he observed, settling into the chair beside hers. "It is," she agreed. "I never really noticed sunsets before coming here. There was always too much to do, too many worries. And now—" "Now I still have worries," she admitted. "But they're different somehow. Less consuming." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping their coffee as the light faded from the sky. Finally, Nora spoke the words she'd been rehearsing all day. "I've decided to file for divorce tomorrow." Vaughn nodded slowly. "I figured as much. It's the right choice, Nora. It won't be easy. There will be scandal, gossip. Even out here people talk." "Let them," he said simply. "Those who matter will understand. Those who don't understand don't matter." The plain-spoken wisdom made her smile. My mother would be horrified by that philosophy. She always said reputation was a woman's most valuable possession. With all due respect to your mother, I'd say your courage is worth more, your kindness, your strength. His blue eyes held hers in the gathering dusk. The way you love those young uns. Heat crept into her cheeks at the quiet admiration in his voice. Sometimes I think coming out west was the making of me, despite everything. Back east, women like me are ornaments, expected to be decorative and agreeable. Out here. She gestured at the vast landscape spread before them. Out here, it seems like you're measured by what you can do, what you can endure. It's a hard land, Vaughn agreed. Doesn't suffer fools or weaklings for long, but it rewards those with grit. He paused, then added softly, "You've got plenty of that, Nora McAllister." The warmth in his voice wrapped around her like a blanket, comforting and exciting all at once. They were sitting close enough that she could see the silver strands in his dark hair catching the last light of day. Close enough to touch if she dared, but the time wasn't right. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and her future was still uncertain, so instead she simply said, "Thank you for believing in me, Vaughn. It means more than I can say." His smile held something that might have been regret or perhaps just understanding. "Get some rest. Tomorrow's an important day." The following morning dawned clear and cool, a welcome respite from the summer heat. Nora dressed with special care in a blue calico dress Vivian had altered to fit her, brushing her chestnut hair until it shone and pinning it in a simple but neat style. She wanted to look respectable, composed, not the desperate woman Gerald would no doubt paint her to be. Vaughn hitched the wagon while Vivian helped prepare the children. They had decided that Emma would come along at 7. She was old enough to understand some of what was happening, and her testimony about being abandoned might prove valuable. Thomas would stay behind with Vivian. The journey to town was mostly silent, Vaughn occasionally pointing out landmarks or wildlife to distract Emma, who sat between them on the wagon seat. Nora was grateful for his steady presence, the solid warmth of his shoulder occasionally brushing hers as the wagon jolted over ruts in the road. Snake River's Main Street was busier than usual. Word of the judge's arrival and the potential for interesting legal proceedings having drawn folks from outlying farms and ranches. Vaughn pulled the wagon up in front of the combined courthouse and jailhouse, a modest wooden building distinguished mainly by its flagpole. "Ready?" he asked quietly as he helped Nora down. "As I'll ever be," she replied, straightening her shoulders. Inside, the makeshift courtroom was already filling with spectators. Sheriff Miller nodded to them from his position near the judge's table, and Nora saw with a jolt that Gerald was seated at the front, his back rigid with tension. Even from behind, she recognized the set of his shoulders, the precisely combed hair. Once, that familiar silhouette had represented security and respectability. Now, it sent a chill through her. Judge Ezekiel Warren, a surprisingly young man with intelligent eyes and a neatly trimmed beard, called the proceedings to order with a sharp rap of his gavel. "First case, McAllister divorce petition. Step forward, please." Heart pounding, Nora approached the table, acutely aware of the whispers rippling through the room. Emma's small hand clutched hers tightly. Vaughn remained a reassuring presence just behind them. Gerald rose as well, his handsome features arranged in an expression of dignified concern that Nora recognized all too well. It was the same face he presented to company when she had accidentally fallen down the stairs or clumsily walked into a door. "Mrs. McAllister," the judge began, "you filed for divorce on grounds of extreme cruelty and abandonment. These are serious charges. Do you stand by them?" "I do, Your Honor," Nora replied, her voice steadier than she had expected. Gerald's expression shifted to one of pained disbelief. "Your Honor, these allegations are completely false. My wife has been unwell, prone to hysteria and delusions. I've been searching frantically for her and my children since she ran off 3 weeks ago." Judge Warren regarded him impassively. "Mr. McAllister, you'll have your chance to speak." He turned back to Nora. "Please tell the court what happened, Mrs. McAllister." Drawing a deep breath, Nora recounted the years of abuse, culminating in Gerald's abandonment of her and the children in the wilderness. She kept her voice even, focusing on facts rather than emotions, though several times she had to pause to collect herself. Had it not been for Mr. Lassiter finding us, we would have died of thirst and exposure, she concluded. My husband left us there deliberately, knowing there was no settlement nearby, no water source. Lies, Gerald interjected, his composure slipping. Your Honor, my wife has clearly been influenced by this rancher. He infused the word with contempt. Who knows what sort of relationship they've developed while she's been living under his roof? Murmurs rippled through the courtroom at the insinuation. Nora felt her face flame, but before she could respond, Emma suddenly stepped forward. My papa hurt my mama, the little girl said clearly, her high voice carrying through the now silent room. He hit her lots of times, he hit me too, then he left us all alone in the hot place with no water. Her chin trembled, but she continued bravely. Mr. Vaughn found us and gave us water. He's nice, my papa is not nice. The simple testimony, delivered with a child's unvarnished honesty, seemed to affect the courtroom more profoundly than all the adult arguments. Even Judge Warren's expression softened as he nodded to Emma. Thank you, young lady, that was very brave. Gerald's face had darkened dangerously, his mask of civility cracking to reveal the rage beneath. The child has been coached, he snarled. This is absurd. I am a respected businessman with connections to Judge Harrington in Boys. Yes, you've mentioned that several times, Judge Warren interrupted dryly. However, Judge Harrington has no jurisdiction here, and your connections don't impress me, sir. He shuffled through some papers before continuing. I have sworn statements from Sheriff Miller regarding Mrs. McAllister's condition when she was brought to town for medical attention, as well as Dr. Phillips' assessment of dehydration and exposure consistent with her account. Nora blinked in surprise. Vaughn must have arranged those statements without telling her. Furthermore, the judge continued, I've received telegrams from Boston in response to my inquiries. Your father-in-law, Mr. Nathan Pierce, confirms that his daughter's letters abruptly ceased after her marriage to you, despite her previously regular correspondence. He has been attempting to locate her for several years. The news struck Nora like a physical blow. Her father had been looking for her all this time. Tears sprang to her eyes as a burden she hadn't even realized she was carrying lifted from her shoulders. Gerald, sensing the case turning against him, changed tactics. Your Honor, I admit there have been difficulties in our marriage. Perhaps I was too harsh at times, but abandonment. I would never save your breath, McAllister, Sheriff Miller interrupted, stepping forward. We found your campsite exactly where Mrs. McAllister described it. Empty water barrels, wagon tracks leading away, one set of tracks. No sign you ever intended to return for them. Judge Warren had heard enough. Based on the evidence presented and the testimony given, I find grounds for divorce on the basis of both extreme cruelty and abandonment. The divorce is granted, with full custody of the children awarded to Mrs. McAllister. He fixed Gerald with a stern gaze. You're fortunate, sir, that your wife prefers a divorce to pressing criminal charges. Were it my decision alone, you'd be facing trial for attempted murder. Relief flooded through Nora so intensely that her knees nearly buckled. It was over. She was free. Gerald, however, was not finished. As the judge prepared to move on to the next case, he surged forward, his face contorted with rage. You can't do this to me. That woman and those children are my property. The outburst confirmed everything Nora had testified about his true nature. Several men in the courtroom rose to their feet, expressions darkening at his words. Vaughn stepped between Gerald and Nora, his posture relaxed but watchful. That's enough, McAllister, Sheriff Miller said sharply. The judge has ruled. Accept it and leave town or spend the night in my jail for contempt of court. For a terrible moment, Nora thought Gerald might actually attack someone. She pulled Emma behind her protectively. But then, as quickly as it had appeared, the rage drained from his face, replaced by the cold calculation she knew so well. Fine, he said, straightening his jacket. She's not worth the trouble anyway, but this isn't over. His eyes met Nora's, and the malice in them made her shiver. "You'll regret this." "The only regret I have," Nora replied steadily, finding courage in Vaughn's solid presence beside her, "is that I didn't leave years ago." With a final venomous glare, Gerald stormed out of the courtroom. The tension in the room dissipated slowly, people beginning to talk again as Judge Warren called for order. "Mrs. McAllister," the judge said quietly when she approached his table to sign the final papers, "there's one more matter. Your father has asked to be notified of your whereabouts should you be found. Would you like me to inform him that you're safe?" Tears welled up again as Nora nodded. "Please, tell him I've missed him, and Mother too, if she'll still speak to me," the judge smiled. "Based on his telegram, I think you'll find your parents more than ready to welcome you home should you wish to return east." That possibility, which would have seemed like a miracle just days ago, now filled Nora with unexpected conflict. Return east, leave Snake River, the Lassiter ranch. Leave Vaughn? The thought brought a sharp pang she wasn't prepared for. "Thank you, Your Honor, I'll consider it." Outside, the bright sunlight seemed to mirror Nora's newfound freedom. Emma skipped ahead to the wagon, the solemnity of the courtroom already forgotten in typical childish resilience. Vaughn walked beside Nora, matching his long stride to her shorter one. "You did well in there," he said quietly. "Stood your ground like a true Westerner." "It was easier knowing I wasn't alone," she replied, glancing up at him. "Thank you for arranging those statements from the sheriff and doctor, and for staying beside me." He shrugged slightly, though his eyes warmed at her gratitude. "Least I could do." He hesitated, then added, "So your folks have been looking for you." "Apparently so," she said, still processing the revelation. "I can hardly believe it. Gerald told me they'd washed their hands of me, that my father said I'd made my choice and would have to live with it. You thinking of going back to Boston?" Vaughn's tone was carefully neutral, but Nora thought she detected something beneath the surface concern, perhaps, or something more personal. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "A week ago I would have said yes without hesitation, but now they had reached the wagon." Emma was already seated, playing with a rag doll Vivian had made her. Vaughn helped Nora up, his hands strong and sure at her waist. As she settled beside Emma, he remained standing beside the wagon, looking up at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Nora," he began, then stopped, seeming to struggle with his words, unusual for a man typically so direct. "Whatever you decide, I want you to know the crack of a gunshot cut through the air, followed immediately by splintering wood as a bullet struck the wagon seat inches from Nora's hand. Screams erupted from the street as people scattered. Vaughn reacted instantly, pulling Nora and Emma down below the wagon's side. "Stay down," he ordered, drawing his own pistol and scanning the surrounding buildings. Sheriff Miller and several deputies were already rushing toward the sound, pistols drawn. Nora clutched Emma to her chest, the little girl whimpering in fear. "Gerald," she whispered, certain her soon-to-be ex-husband was responsible. "Probably," Vaughn agreed grimly. "He's just made the biggest mistake of his life." A second shot rang out, this one going wide. People were pointing toward the hotel balcony, where a figure could be seen retreating inside. Sheriff Miller and his men converged on the building. "I'm getting you two out of here," Vaughn said, jumping into the wagon and seizing the reins. With a sharp command to the horses, he turned the wagon around and headed out of town at a gallop, keeping his body positioned to shield Nora and Emma as much as possible. They were halfway back to the ranch when Sheriff Miller and two deputies caught up with them, riding hard. "McAllister's dead," the sheriff called as he pulled alongside. "Took a shot at my deputy when we tried to arrest him. Got himself killed for the trouble." The news hit Nora like a physical blow. Dead, Gerald was dead. The man she had once loved, then feared for years, was gone forever. She should have felt relief, perhaps even satisfaction, but instead a complex tangle of emotions washed over her: shock, grief for what might have been, and finally a sense of closure so profound it left her lightheaded. "You folks all right?" Miller asked, eyeing the bullet hole in the wagon seat. "Shaken up but unharmed," Vaughn replied, his arm still protectively around Nora and Emma. "Good, I'll ride out tomorrow to take formal statements, but there's no doubt it was self-defense on our part. McAllister fired first, both at your family and at my men. The sheriff tipped his hat. You're well and truly free now, Mrs. McAllister. For what it's worth, I'm sorry it ended this way. As the lawman rode back toward town, Vaughn slowed the wagon to a more comfortable pace. Emma, resilient as always, had fallen asleep against Nora's side, exhausted by the day's events. How are you feeling? Vaughn asked quietly. I don't know, Nora admitted. I never wanted him dead despite everything, just gone from our lives. That's because you're a good person, he said simply. Only natural to have mixed feelings. They rode in silence for a while, each lost in thought. Finally, Nora spoke again. What were you going to say? Back in town before the shooting? Vaughn's hands tightened on the reins, then relaxed. I was going to say that whatever you decide about Boston, about your future, I hope you'll consider staying here, in Snake River. He glanced at her briefly before returning his attention to the road. With me. The simple declaration, delivered without flourish or demands, touched Nora deeply. Vaughn, you don't need to answer now, he interrupted gently. You've been through hell today, just think about it. Nora looked at his profile, strong and steady against the backdrop of the Idaho landscape. In Boston, she would have security, family, the familiar comforts of civilization. But here, she had found something else, something she was just beginning to recognize as essential. I don't need time, she said softly. I've known for days that I don't want to leave, not Snake River, not the ranch. She took a deep breath. Not you. Vaughn pulled the wagon to a halt, turning to face her fully. The hope in his blue eyes made her heart skip. You're sure it's not much I can offer a small ranch, hard work, simple living? It's everything, she contradicted, reaching out to touch his weathered cheek. Safety, respect, kindness. The chance to build something real, she smiled tremulously. The chance to love without fear. Something shifted in Vaughn's expression, a softening that transformed his rugged features. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned forward and kissed her a gentle, questioning kiss that asked rather than demanded. Nora responded with all the newfound courage in her heart, her free arms sliding around his neck as Emma slept on, oblivious between them. When they broke apart, Vaughn rested his forehead against hers. I've been falling in love with you since the day I found you in that desert, he confessed quietly. You and these young'uns. Never thought I'd have a family of my own, but if you'll have me. We'll have you, Nora whispered back, her heart fuller than she'd ever imagined possible. All of us. With a smile that transformed his entire face, Vaughn picked up the reins again. Then let's go home. Home, the word had never sounded so beautiful. The news of Gerald McAllister's death and the circumstances surrounding it spread quickly through Snake River and the surrounding area. Far from facing condemnation for her divorce and the subsequent violence, Nora found herself the recipient of unexpected support from the small community. Women brought food and offers of help with the children, while men stopped by the ranch to assist Vaughn with repairs and chores, their way of showing solidarity. Folks out here don't abide men who hurt women and children, Vivian explained when Nora expressed surprise at the reaction. Most everyone's had to fight too hard to survive to have patience for that kind of cruelty. In the weeks that followed, Nora sent a long letter to her parents in Boston, explaining everything that had happened and introducing them to the idea of Vaughn. Their reply came faster than she expected, a tearful, ink-blotched missive from her mother expressing profound relief that she was alive and well, along with a more measured but equally emotional note from her father. They wanted to visit as soon as arrangements could be made, a prospect that both excited and terrified Nora. What if they don't approve of all this? She fretted to Vaughn one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, a habit they had developed since her decision to stay. Of the ranch, of Snake River, of us, Vaughn considered the question with his usual thoughtfulness. Then they don't, he said finally. Won't change how I feel about you or our plans, but I think you're borrowing trouble. Sounds to me like your folks just want to see you happy and safe. His calm confidence soothed her anxiety, as it so often did. Over the past month, their relationship had deepened steadily, measured in small moments rather than grand gestures. Vaughn teaching Emma to ride her own pony. His patient lessons with Nora on handling a rifle, just in case. The way Thomas now reached for him as readily as for Nora or Vivian. They had agreed to wait until Nora's divorce was fully finalized before making any formal commitment, but their intentions were clear to anyone who saw them together. Vivian had taken to humming wedding songs whenever they were in the same room, a teasing habit that made Vaughn roll his eyes but never actually contradict. As autumn approached, bringing cooler temperatures and the brilliant colors of changing leaves along the river, Nora found herself settling more deeply into life at Rocking L Ranch. She learned to make soap from Vivian, to preserve vegetables from the garden for winter, to bake bread in the temperamental wood stove. Small skills that had never been part of her privileged Eastern upbringing, but which now gave her immense satisfaction. Emma thrived in the freedom of country living, developing a passion for horses that had Vaughn predicting she'd be out driving him before she was 12. Thomas took his first steps in the ranch house kitchen, toddling unsteadily from Vivian to Nora while Vaughn watched with undisguised pride, as invested in the baby's achievement as if Thomas were his own son. In many ways, Nora reflected, Thomas already was Vaughn's son in all the ways that truly mattered. And Emma was rapidly becoming his daughter, following him around the ranch and soaking up his knowledge of animals and the land with an enthusiasm that delighted them both. The Pierces arrived from Boston in early October, making the long journey by train to the nearest station and then by stagecoach to Snake River. Nora waited anxiously on the porch as Vaughn drove the wagon into town to collect them, Emma bouncing with excitement beside her at the prospect of meeting her grandparents for the first time. When the wagon finally appeared on the horizon, Nora's heart raced with a mixture of joy and apprehension. So much had changed since she had last seen her parents. Would they recognize the woman she had become? Would they understand the choices she had made? Elizabeth Pierce was the first to descend from the wagon, her elegant traveling suit dusty from the journey, but her face alight with emotion as she caught sight of her daughter. "Nora," she cried, hurrying forward with outstretched arms, all Eastern reserve forgotten. The reunion was tearful and joyous, made even more poignant by Nathan Pierce's gruff attempts to hide his own emotions as he embraced his daughter for the first time in 7 years. Emma was presented, Thomas admired, and Vaughn formally introduced, standing somewhat awkwardly in his clean but simple ranch clothes as he faced Nora's clearly wealthy parents. "So you're the man who saved our daughter and grandchildren," Nathan Pierce said, appraising Vaughn with keen eyes that missed nothing. "We owe you a debt that can never be repaid, Mr. Lassiter." "No debt, sir," Vaughn replied steadily. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Elizabeth Pierce contradicted gently. "Not anyone. We learned that lesson at great cost when we trusted Gerald McAllister's charming facade." "Mama," Nora interjected, seeing Vaughn's discomfort with the praise, "let's get everyone settled. You must be exhausted from your journey." The first evening was spent in careful conversation, the Pierces asking questions about the ranch, the territory, and Snake River itself, while tactfully avoiding the more painful subjects of Gerald and the years of separation. Nora could see her mother taking in every detail of the modest ranch house so different from their Boston mansion. But Elizabeth made no comment beyond praising Vivian's cooking and admiring the handmade quilts on the beds. It was the following day, while Vaughn and Nathan took Emma to see the new foal in the barn, that Elizabeth finally spoke frankly to her daughter as they sat shelling peas on the porch. "He's a good man, your Mr. Lassiter," she observed, her hands never pausing in their task. "Nothing like what we expected for you, of course, but after Gerald." She sighed deeply. "Your father and I will never forgive ourselves for not seeing through that man's pretenses." "It wasn't your fault, Mama," Nora said gently. "Gerald fooled everyone, including me." "He didn't show his true nature until after we were married." Elizabeth nodded sadly. "Even so, we should have fought harder to maintain contact. Your father sent letters, hired investigators when you stopped writing." But Gerald always had explanations, always managed to convince people that all was well. That was his talent, Nora acknowledged, making others see only what he wanted them to see. She glanced toward the barn where Vaughn was lifting Emma up to pet the foal's nose, her father watching with a smile. Vaughn is different. What you see is what he is: honest, hardworking, kind. And you love him, Elizabeth said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Nora admitted, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks despite being a grown woman and mother of two. More than I thought possible, her mother's face softened. It shows, my dear, in both of you. She reached over to pat Nora's hand. Your father and I didn't come all this way to judge your choices or try to persuade you to return east. We came to assure ourselves that you're truly happy and safe. Relief flooded through Nora. I am, Mama. For the first time in years, I truly am. Then that's all that matters, Elizabeth said firmly, returning to her peas. Though I do hope you'll consider a proper wedding before too long. I'm not getting any younger, and I'd like to see my only daughter married to a man worthy of her. Nora laughed, a free, joyful sound that still sometimes surprised her. I think that can be arranged. The Pierces stayed for 2 weeks, gradually adjusting to the rhythm of ranch life. Nathan, to everyone's surprise, took a keen interest in Vaughn's breeding program for the ranch horses, offering to invest in a quality stallion from Kentucky that would improve the stock. Vaughn, initially resistant to what he perceived as charity, eventually accepted the offer as a legitimate business partnership. Elizabeth, meanwhile, won Vivian's eternal devotion by teaching her Boston cooking techniques and bringing trunks full of fabric, patterns, and other luxuries difficult to obtain in Idaho. Together, they secretly began work on a wedding dress for Nora, though no formal engagement had yet been announced. On their final evening before departing, Nathan asked Vaughn to join him for a walk after supper. Nora watched them go with a mixture of hope and trepidation, suspecting what her father intended to discuss. The two men returned an hour later, both looking pleased if somewhat reserved. Vaughn caught Nora's questioning glance and gave a small nod that set her heart racing. Later, after her parents had retired to their room and Vivian had gone to check on the children, Vaughn pulled Nora onto the porch. Your father gave his blessing, he said without preamble, drawing her close. Said he'd never seen you so alive, so much yourself, as you are here with me. He's right, Nora whispered, leaning into his embrace. I never knew who I truly was until I came here, until you found us. Vaughn's arms tightened around her. Been carrying this for weeks, waiting for the right moment, he murmured, reaching into his pocket. What he withdrew was not the gold band she had half expected, but something far more meaningful: a small, carved wooden horse, polished to a soft gleam. Made it myself, he explained, a rare hint of uncertainty in his voice. It's not fancy like what you had in Boston, but it's perfect, Nora interrupted, taking the small carving with reverent hands. The detail was exquisite, the horse captured in mid-gallop with flowing mane and tail. But I don't understand. First gift my father gave my mother was a carving just like this, Vaughn explained, his voice soft with memory. Said it represented freedom and partnership all at once, been a tradition in my family for generations. His blue eyes held hers intently. Nora McAllister, will you marry me? Be my partner in everything: this ranch, those children, whatever life brings us? Yes, she breathed, tears of joy spilling down her cheeks. Yes, Vaughn Lassiter, I will. His kiss was tender yet passionate, a promise of the life they would build together. When they finally parted, both breathless, Vaughn rested his forehead against hers. Your folks leave tomorrow, he murmured, but they said they'd return for a wedding whenever we decide. Spring, Nora decided immediately, when everything's new and growing. And that will give Mama and Vivian time to finish the dress they think I don't know they're making. Vaughn chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest against her cheek. Nothing gets past you anymore, does it? Not much, she agreed with a smile. I've learned to pay attention to what matters. They were married the following April, with apple blossoms scenting the air and the Snake River running high with spring melt. Judge Warren performed the ceremony in the town church, with Nathan Pierce giving his daughter away and Emma serving as a beaming flower girl. Thomas, now a sturdy toddler, was carried by Vivian, who had finally allowed herself to be courted by the town's shy blacksmith. The whole settlement turned out for the celebration, the small church overflowing with ranchers, townspeople, and even a contingent of Nez Perce from the nearby reservation with whom Vaughn had established friendly relations. Sheriff Miller stood as Vaughn's best man, while Elizabeth Pierce, elegantly out of place in her Boston finery but radiant with happiness for her daughter, occupied the front pew. The dress Vivian and Elizabeth had created was a triumph of simplicity and elegance, ivory silk with delicate embroidery at the bodice and hem. Nothing like the elaborate gown Nora had worn for her first wedding. This time, as she walked toward Vaughn, she felt only joy and certainty, no hint of the doubt that had plagued her even as she had married Gerald. Their vows were straightforward and heartfelt, spoken clearly for all to hear. When Judge Warren pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up nearly raised the church's roof. Vaughn kissed his bride with a tenderness that brought tears to even the most hardened cowboy's eyes, then swung a laughing Emma up into his arms as they walked back down the aisle as a family. The celebration continued well into the night with food and dancing in the town square. As darkness fell, lanterns were lit, casting a golden glow over the festivities. Nathan and Elizabeth Pierce watched their daughter dancing with her new husband, her face alight with happiness. "She belongs here," Elizabeth observed softly to her husband. "With him, I can see that now." "Yes," Nathan agreed, his own expression reflective. "Though I'll miss having her close, I'd rather see her happy from a distance than miserable within reach." Across the square, Vaughn pulled Nora away from the dancing, leading her to a quiet corner where they could speak privately. "Happy, Mrs. Lassiter?" he asked, his blue eyes warm as they took in her flushed face and bright eyes. "Incredibly," she assured him, still marveling at her new name. "Though I think I may need some time to get used to that. We have plenty of time," he promised, drawing her close. "A lifetime." As they stood together under the star-filled Idaho sky, Nora reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the privileged but constrained girl in Boston, to the terrified wife fleeing abuse, to the desperate mother stranded in the wilderness, and now to this. A woman who had found her strength, her voice, and her true partner. "What are you thinking?" Vaughn asked, noting her thoughtful expression. "About that day in the desert," she replied honestly. "When you found us and said, 'Come with me,' I was so afraid, but something in your eyes made me trust you anyway." She looked up at him, her heart full. "Best decision I ever made." "For both of us," he agreed, bending to kiss her once more beneath the vast western sky that had become their home. 5 years later, Nora stood on the porch of the rocking L Ranch house, watching as Vaughn taught their son James to rope a practice post in the yard. At 3, James was the spitting image of his father, with the same determined blue eyes and quiet concentration. Beside them, 8-year-old Thomas was attempting to copy his stepfather's technique, while Emma, now 10 and accomplished on horseback, called out advice from atop her pinto mare. The ranch had prospered under Vaughn and Nora's joint management. The Kentucky stallion Nathan Pierce had provided had indeed improved their stock, making rocking L horses sought after throughout the territory. They had expanded the house to accommodate their growing family, adding rooms and modern conveniences as their success allowed. Vivian had married her blacksmith 2 years earlier and now lived in town, expecting her first child. She visited often, the siblings' bond undiminished by her marriage. The Pierces made the journey west annually, staying for a month each summer and delighting in their grandchildren's growth. Snake River itself had grown as well, the railroad's arrival 3 years ago bringing new settlers and opportunities. Vaughn now served on the town council, his straightforward honesty and fairness making him respected even by those who disagreed with his politics. As for Nora, she had found her own place in the community, teaching reading and writing to children and adults 3 afternoons a week in the small schoolhouse. The frightened woman who had arrived with nothing had become a confident, respected figure in Snake River, known for her compassion, intelligence, and the quiet strength that matched her husband's. The sound of a rider approaching drew Nora's attention. Sheriff Miller, now gray-haired but still sharp-eyed, rode into the yard with a wave. "Afternoon, Mrs. Lassiter," he called. "Got something for you and Vaughn." "Come have some coffee, Isaac," she invited, gesturing to the pot keeping warm on the stove. The sheriff had become a close friend over the years, a regular visitor to the ranch. As Vaughn joined them on the porch, wiping dust from his hands, Miller pulled a letter from his pocket. "This came for you both, from back east." The letter bore the return address of a Boston law firm Nora didn't recognize. With a puzzled frown, she opened it, Vaughn reading over her shoulder. "It's about Gerald's estate," she said in surprise, scanning the legal language. Apparently he had investments that have finally been settled. As his widow, I'm entitled to a portion." "You're not his widow," Vaughn pointed out with a slight edge to his voice. Even after all these years, Gerald McAllister's name could still bring a shadow to his expression. The divorce was final before he died. True, but the lawyer explains that since the divorce settlement didn't address these particular assets, and as the mother of his legal heirs. She continued reading, her eyes widening. "Vaughn, it's a substantial amount. More than enough to build that new barn you've been planning, and perhaps even send Emma back east to that girls' school Mama keeps mentioning." Sheriff Miller sipped his coffee, watching them with amusement. "Fate has a way of evening things out, doesn't it? Man left you to die, and now his money's going to help your family thrive." "I'm not sure how I feel about it," Nora admitted, setting the letter down. "Taking his money even for the children." "Think of it as restitution," Vaughn suggested, his initial tension fading. "For all he put you through, use it for something good." He glanced toward the yard where the children were still playing. "Maybe set some aside for their futures. Education, opportunities." Nora nodded slowly, seeing the wisdom in his approach. "You're right. We can turn this into something positive." She looked up at her husband with a smile. "As we've done with everything else life has thrown at us." Later that night, with the children asleep and the house quiet, Nora and Vaughn sat on their porch as they had done nearly every evening since she first came to the ranch. The habit had survived marriage, children, and the expansion of the house to include a proper parlor. Something about watching the sun set over the Idaho landscape together had become sacred to them both. "Been thinking about that money," Vaughn said, his arm around her shoulders. "Might be good to put some toward a scholarship at the school. For children who couldn't otherwise afford books and such." The suggestion touched Nora deeply. "Gerald would hate that," she observed, "using his money to educate those he considered beneath him." A small smile played at the corners of Vaughn's mouth. "Might have factored into my thinking." She laughed softly, leaning into his embrace. "I love that about you, how you can turn even difficult things into something good." "Learned that from you," he countered, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Remember that first day when I found you barely alive in that desert? Most folks would have been broken by what you'd endured, but you were still fighting, still protecting those children with everything you had." "I had no choice," she said. "They needed me." "And that's what makes you extraordinary, Nora Lassiter," Vaughn said, his voice hushed with admiration even after 5 years of marriage. "Your courage, your heart." They fell silent, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. The peacefulness of the moment was profound, a hard-earned tranquility that neither took for granted. "Do you ever regret it?" Nora asked suddenly. "Taking on a desperate woman and 2 children who weren't yours, it would have been easier to ride on, find help, and send it back." Vaughn considered the question with his usual thoughtfulness. "Not for a single moment," he finally answered, his voice certain. "The day I found you was the day my life truly began. Everything before was just waiting." "For what?" she asked softly. "For you," he replied simply. "For Emma and Thomas, for James, for all of it." He gestured toward their home, the ranch, the life they had built together. "I didn't know it then, but when I said come with me that day, I was really asking you to come on this whole journey, and somehow you trusted me enough to say yes." Nora turned in his arms, bringing her hand to his cheek still weathered from sun and wind, now with deeper lines that spoke of both laughter and care. "Best decision I ever made," she whispered, echoing her words from their wedding night. As his lips met hers in a kiss still rich with passion after all these years, Nora marveled at how life's darkest moments could lead to its greatest joys. The desperate woman abandoned in the heat with her children had found not just rescue, but love, partnership, and a home that fulfilled her in ways she had never imagined possible. When a cowboy had found them and said, "Come with me," she had taken a leap of faith that changed everything. And every day since had proven the wisdom of that choice.